King George VI once said, "The history of York is the history of England." Truer words were never spoken. The rivers Foss and Ouse come together in the south of the city. The area was initially surrounded by marshes, and the Romans were quick to recognize its defensive attributes, establishing a garrison here in 71 AD. They went on to build a wooden fort on the site around 76 AD. Then, unlike today, the rivers were tidal and gave a good trade access to the sea. The wooden fort was replaced with a more substantial stone construction around 300 AD, which became the permanent legionary fort called Iberacum. Overwhelming evidence of Roman presence can still be seen in York today. This part of the Roman wall can be found near the York Art Gallery in Exhibition Square. As with many of the early buildings in York, new structures were built on top of existing ones. A prime example of this can be seen here in the museum gardens. These walls and the multangular tower plainly show the distinct layers of time. From the rear of the tower, the different stratas can be very clearly seen. With the tower to your back, you can see this pathway and walls. These are part of the old Roman walls. The small tower is known as the Anglian Tower. Although thought by some to be Anglian, it's probably late Roman. On the other side of this tower can be found the layers of construction dating from the 1st century AD through to the medieval 13th century. On the junction of Davygate and Parliament Street can be found the Roman Baths pub. This isn't just a fanciful name, for underneath the pub are the remains of a Roman baths which are open to public viewing. As with many of the exhibitions in York, extensive use of modern technology has been used to inform and interact with the visitors. In this example, the question asked was, did the water used in the baths come from the river?
Dear no. Have you seen it? The river water's filthy. What with all the old rubbish that's dumped in there? We'd have to pump it or carry it here. Simply can't be done. We need too much. Oh no, our water comes by aqueduct from the hills beyond Iberacum. Not one of them fancy aqueducts they have around Rome. A pipe does the job just as well.
Coppergate and the very heart of York. Here can be found the Jorvik Viking Centre. More than just an attraction, it's a real archaeological site. Richard Kemp explains.
Well, when you go to the Jorvik Viking Centre here in the heart of York, you're not just visiting a visitor attraction. You are actually descending into an archaeological excavation that was conducted by the York Archaeological Trust in the 1970s. There we found timber buildings perfectly preserved through waterlogging for 1,000 years. We also found cesspits and rubbish pits and the everyday detritus of everyday life. And using scientific techniques, we can build up a very, very detailed picture of exactly what life was like in the year 948, which is what we've done. So when you go into the Viking Centre, everything you see, every last little detail is based on archaeological evidence. We've got cesspits full of Viking you-know-what, and from that we can tell what people had in their stomachs, what they were eating. We can reconstruct the environment by the bugs and the beetles and the seeds and the twigs and the leaves that are preserved in the cesspits. So that is not just a fanciful reconstruction that you see, it's actually based on archaeological evidence. And not just our own reconstruction, but the actual evidence upon which that reconstruction is based. You can see the finds, the huge great Viking oak timbers that were used to make those buildings. So come with me and let's descend into the bowels of the earth and go into that excavation and see what it was actually like in Viking York.
Here, deep below the streets of Rome, the past.
At the house Between 1976 and 1981, a team from the York Archaeological Trust uncovered the actual remains of the wooden Viking buildings that we've just seen. The heart is in its original place, with the blackened area where the fire burned, resulting objects in the soil. But in workshops, we're finding tools, jewelers' amber, jet chippings, wood turning shavings, and other debris.
Okay, well, we've just come round the corner from Coppergate, which of course is Viking Street, to another Viking Street, High Ousegate. In the Viking period, this would be teeming with buildings just the same as those we've seen in the Viking Centre. I wouldn't want you to run away with the idea that that's all there was. In the Viking period, there were 10,000 people living in Viking Jorvik. Behind me, you can see this church has a Viking grave cover inside it. This was a Viking church, and all the buildings owe their origins to the Viking period. When we were doing the excavation of the Viking Centre, the very first thing we found was a 19th century sweet factory. It had 4 subdivisions. Underneath that, we found 4 Norman buildings in the same subdivisions, and underneath that, the Viking buildings that we've just seen. It shows you that the Vikings laid out this part of York in the way that they did, the year 910, and we're still living with the buildings that the Vikings laid out. So when you go to Burger King, GT Sports or Shoe Fair, you are actually going into not Viking houses, but the Viking plots that were laid out, that have then been rebuilt and rebuilt over the years. Now, if you're interested to know how archaeologists actually do their job and how they uncover evidence from the past, then I'd like to take you to the Archaeological Resource Centre. Okay, well, if you want to get experience of actually doing what archaeologists do all the time, then here at the Ark you can. This place is a museum with no glass cases. You can touch everything. In fact, you must touch to get plenty out of the Ark. The first activity involves taking archaeological material that we've actually dug up and sorting it out, taking natural materials from man-made materials. And you're handling Roman and Viking pieces of material. From there, you go on to sort out bones. What can you tell about bones? What size was a Viking cow? Then go across to look at pottery. What different pottery did they use from the Roman period, from the Viking period, from the medieval period? We then go on to the experimental area where you can have a go at working out how a Viking barrel padlock worked. This is a replica of the one we saw at the Viking Centre. Write your name in runes, make a mosaic, spin or weave, or even make a shoe in Viking fashion. And then go on to the high-tech computers where you can interrogate banks of databases about the finds that are made in York. But at the Ark, you can be an archaeologist for a couple of hours.
Parliament Street is in the main shopping area. It's here that the market begins and extends around the corner. This part of the market backs on to the famous Shambles. The street itself is mentioned in the Domesday Book, written over 900 years ago. The Shambles, up until the early 1930s, was predominantly butchers' shops. The houses overhang so much the sun rarely, if ever, strikes the pavement. It's on this street that Margaret Clitheroe lived until she was executed in 1586 for harbouring Jesuit priests in the time of Catholic suppression. She was canonised in 1970. The assembly rooms, situated in Blake Street, were built by architect Lord Burlington in 1735. It's said to be the finest Georgian building in York. Originally built as a meeting place where Georgian high society could enjoy such entertainment as music, dancing, gambling, concerts and other social activities. Even Strauss played here. The building has seen many changes throughout its history. The stylish Venetian chandeliers are authentic replicas of an original gift from Lord Burlington himself. In the 1880s, the Victorians charged a half-penny to look down into the assembly rooms from the roof. In the Second World War, the building was used as a centre for food rationing. In the 1950s, redecoration took place, retaining the marbling effect on the wood and plaster columns and gilding detail on the colonnades. In the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the assembly rooms were used regularly for weekend rock and roll dances. After an extensive piling operation in the 1990s to support the entire structure, the magnificent assembly rooms was reopened once again to the public and now boasts an excellent restaurant, cafe, ballroom and function room. In Castlegate, just 100 metres from the Jorvik Centre, is Fairfax House, one of the finest 18th century townhouses remaining in England, and it's the home of the Terry's collection of English furniture and clocks. Also in Castlegate is the Impressions Gallery, with a diverse array of facilities.
This is the Impressions Gallery on Castlegate in York. The gallery is 25 years old. It's been well established in York since the early 70s. It's a gallery that has an international reputation for producing the highest quality contemporary photography exhibitions. Our exhibitions programme is very wide-ranging and diverse and is of the phenomenal standard. The current show that we have on at the moment is Jorma Puranen's Curiosus Naturae Spectator, which is a commission which forms part of the 10 European commissions, the biggest ever European photography commissions ever seen in this country. We have darkroom facilities here, both colour and black and white, which are available to hire by individuals and groups, often hired by schools and community groups. They comprise 8 black and white conventional darkrooms, 1 5x4 colour, and we have ilfrachrome and cibachrome and C-type colour processing facilities here, as well as conventional black and white. We also run a whole series of courses in both conventional chemical photography and in digital imaging and electronic darkroom practices. So digital imaging, this is the new technology, new era. We're going into the 21st century, and Impressions also provides access to Apple Mac facilities with a whole range of software practices, scanning, internet access. We're subsidised by the Arts Council and Yorkshire Humberside Arts, and we do this as part of our educational strategy initiative, so people are welcome to come along to these courses at very reasonable rates. We also provide internet access. You can just walk in off the street and log on and send an email home if you happen to be from outside of York. Impressions Gallery also has a great cafe, a nice spacey, airy cafe, which can be found at the Fenwick side of the building. The cafe has a reputation for providing what is well known as the best cappuccino in York. In addition to that, we serve light lunches, snacks, a whole range of exotic desserts and juices and so on. The gallery's open 9:30 to 5:30, Monday to Saturday, and 10 o'clock until 5 o'clock on Sundays.
The Royal Dragoon Guards and the Prince of Wales' own Regiment of Yorkshire also have their museum here in Castlegate. These regiments have so much history between them, it's hard to know where to begin. These paintings in the foyer show the West Yorkshire Regiment in action at Famar in 1793 and Bupar in 1826. The museum is laid out in 2 halves, with the Prince of Wales' Yorkshire own to the left and the Royal Dragoon Guards to the right. Although the museum is on a lower level than the street, a stairlift is available, giving access to everyone. There are an enormous number of medals on display, these being just a few awarded to members of the Prince of Wales' own. This magnificent mess silver came from the 2nd Battalion of the West Yorkshire Own and contains 6 of the regiment's battle honours gained at Tournai, Corunna, Java, Waterloo, Beauport and New Zealand. The museum contains a large array of historical objects relating to the regiments. This lance dates from 1685 and was used by the 15th of Foot East Yorks Regiment. This Brown Bess type flintlock musket was in use in 1758. The First World War saw the capture of this early heavy machine gun by the 11th Battalion in 1917 at the Battle of Anse. There are also exhibits from the Second World War. The Royal Dragoon Guards come from a very long line of regiments originating around 1685. The regiments saw action all over the world and won many battle honours. Bravery and courage wasn't confined to the battlefield. Captain Oates from the 6th Dragoon Guards was a member of the ill-fated 1912 Scott Antarctic expedition. When it became apparent there was insufficient food for all the party to survive, he walked out into the blizzard and certain death. His parting words have gone down in history. "I'm just going outside. I may be gone some time." One of many examples of bravery and courage to be found within this museum. Facing the Royal Dragoon Guards Museum stands Clifford's Tower. This has been the keep of successive military forts on this site for hundreds of years. In 1068, William the Conqueror built a wooden fort here to defend against rebellious factions in the north. Clifford's Tower, as we see it now, formed part of a stone castle built by Henry III between 1245 and 1248 as a more substantial replacement. This painting, on display in the Castle Museum, shows what the tower and fort installations looked like around 1259. Not all of the tower's history is honourable, for in 1190 a mob, incited by Richard Malabise, attacked the Jewish community of York, who took refuge in the tower. The inscription tells the rest of the story. The tower is open to the public with access to the top of the walls. Forming part of Tower Gate is the York Castle Museum. The museum is housed in 2 parts. The female prison, completed in 1783, holds half the collection, with the other half housed in the adjacent debtors' prison. The first exhibit is an example of a Victorian parlour, but as you can see, some things never change. It still has to be dusted. There's an enormous variety of household items on display, dating from Edwardian England to objects that can be seen in everyday use. This is the man who started it all, Dr. Kirk, a country doctor working in North Yorkshire in the 1890s. He realised that everyday objects were being discarded and lost forever, and so he started collecting them. By 1935, he was finding it increasingly difficult to display his ever-growing collection. So when he was approached by York City Councillor, Alderman John Bowes Morell, with the ideal location for his collection, he agreed to donate it to the City of York and to supervise its display. The York Castle Museum of Everyday Life was eventually opened in 1938. Although I'm not sure this magnificent early chronometer, thought to have been made by James Cox of London around 1775, could be described as an everyday object. The agricultural community didn't escape Kirk's attentions, resulting in this fine collection of everyday farming implements, including this very early 17th century example of mechanized winnowing machine used to separate the wheat from the chaff. Kirk's undoubted genius for presentation can be seen here with the recreation of a complete street called Kirkgate. For not only did he collect individual items, he rescued complete shops that were due for demolition, fire stations, chemists, even a coaching house, and then used them to display his burgeoning collections in the very shops that would have sold them. This coach was used between Stockton and Darlington. However, as a result of the railways opening in the 1820s along the same route, it didn't last for very long. At the far end of the street, in Princess Mary Court, Cook's Optical Instrument Shop displays a fine selection of optical instruments dating from the 18th century. There can also be found a working example of an amusement arcade machine of Al Jolson. This 1905 Shand Mason fire engine, affectionately named Arkle, saw service in the local Rowntree chocolate factory before being donated to the museum. York Castle has a long and checkered history. This cannon was recovered during the dredging of the River Ouse in the 19th century. Its precise origins are unknown, but being a breech-loading cannon, it could have been used on a small galleon or in a fort. At this point, we move across to the other half of the museum, into what was the debtors' prison. The origins of the museum are never too far away. On the top floor, a fine collection of armour and military uniforms can be seen, as well as an exhibition on the Second World War. There's an extensive display of textiles and a superb costume collection of 18th, 19th and 20th century dresses. This white muslin day dress would have been the height of fashion around 1816 to 1820. A second street, called Half Moon Court, is dedicated to the Edwardian era. The two cars in Wales and Sons are typical of the times. The car on the right is an 1899 Grout and was driven by steam. The other is a 1909 Colibri petrol engine car. As a prison, it was here in this courtyard that the prisoners would come to have their shackles removed, the graffiti written as they waited. Some would be due for release. Others would have come from this cell, and it would have been the last thing they did before being executed. It's thought that Dick Turpin spent his last night in this cell before being executed on the Knavesmire on the 7th of April 1739 for horse stealing. Behind the prison runs the River Foss, and here can be found a complete working watermill. The mill was taken from the foot of the Raindale Valley, where it worked for many years, and until quite recently flour was still being ground here. As you can see, all the machinery still functions. The River Foss is the smaller of the two rivers in York. However, it still plays an important part, taking visitors on sightseeing trips upstream into the city. Here we can see how entwined the river and city are, this bridge being only 100 metres from the middle of the city. This hall is the Hall of the Merchant Venturers. This magnificent guild hall was built in the 1350s and is still in use today. In the stone undercroft is an almshouse or hospital where the poor of the city were cared for. The Foss, albeit smaller than the Ouse, has a tendency to flood. To help with the management of this, a new flood control system has been installed just downstream from the Castle Museum. As you can see, the sediment left on this pavement bears testimony to this. The larger River Ouse has played a major part in the city from the very beginning, providing trade routes to the sea and as a means of transport. The tower at the far side of Lendal Bridge is one of the oldest waterworks in England, dating back to the 17th century. And even now, the river still plays a major part in the city's tourist trade. This is the Guild Hall, originally built in the 15th century. Inside the hall, pillars cut from solid oak tree trunks support a magnificent timber roof. The stone for the minster was brought to York by barge, Beneath the hall is an underground passage where the stone was unloaded. So much of Old York can be seen from the river. Who knows the origins of this and all the other river archways? Visitors can hire small motorboats to explore along the riverbank, or take an extended trip with the Pride of York down to the Bishop of York's palace at Bishop Thorpe, a round trip of about an hour. This starts as you pass under Skeldergate Bridge, an informed skipper pointing out all the places of interest as you go along. This area was formerly the docks, where Terry's chocolate factory unloaded its raw materials.
To the right is an area known as Skeldergate Wharves. This is the former site for the unloading of the daily steamboats which ran from Hull to York until the beginning of this century. That factory was the predecessor of the present factory further downstream.
On the other side of the river is the mouth of the foss, with a delightful walk extending along the riverbank. This archway marks the site of an old spring known as Ladywell, once a very important source of clean drinking water for the community. All this sightseeing can be very thirsty work, and there's a bar and cafe aboard the boat for refreshments. As the boat approaches Keyes Bend, Fulford Hall comes into sight. The Bend was named after Captain Keyes, who built himself this 16th century residence. Today it's a country club with tennis courts and a 9-hole golf course. The river passes under this modern road bridge built in 1976 to carry the York A64 bypass. It still retains the remnants of the original wooden bridge beneath it, said to have been a favourite haunt of the highwayman Dick Turpin. This is what these visitors have come to see: Bishop Thorpe Palace, the official residence of the Bishop of York. Built in 1241 by Walter de Grey, it's been extensively modernised and added to throughout its history. It's here the captain must turn his boat ready for the return trip. Once turned, the passengers are given a detailed and informed commentary on the building and its history.
Elegant and ornate marble fittings and plaster ceilings are prominent features of the building.
These stained glass windows carry the coats of arms of all the previous bishops of York. Should the weather take a turn for the worse, the boat has a large covered cabin in which to take shelter. Although the return trip covers the same route, there's always something new or interesting to be seen. For example, there are many pleasure craft still using the river, like this old longboat. Or this modern river cruiser. Some companies offer boating holidays on the river. The large building in the distance is the new Terry's chocolate factory. Hidden from view on the outward trip, it can be plainly seen on the way back. With Skeldergate Bridge in sight, the trip nears its end. Although it's quite cool, some brave souls still prefer the panoramic views from the upper deck. When Skeldergate Bridge was originally constructed, the small arch on the right would open to allow tall-masted boats access to the city. It also made it easier to collect the taxes from them. As the passengers disembark, the crew prepare the boat for the next trip. Adjacent to the quay is a small park, where visitors can break for lunch, just sit, or even use it as a meeting place. The keen-eyed viewer may have noticed the York Law Courts and Clifford's Tower in the background, for they're only about 200 metres away from here. Fishgate Postern Tower was built around 1505, with a wall along one side only. For when the tower was built, the River Foss was much wider and flowed past the tower where the road is today. In those days, these people wouldn't be passing the tower here, not even in a boat, for the small outcrop above their heads is where the tower's toilet emptied straight into the river below. If you walk for about 500 metres from Fishgate Tower in the direction of Fishgate Bar, you'll come to Warmgate Bar, and a sight that can't be seen anywhere else in England. For Warmgate Bar has the only complete barbican standing in England, parts of its masonry dating back to medieval times. The function of the barbican was quite simple, to protect the most vulnerable part of the wall, that being the door. For not only had attackers got to break in the first outer door, once inside the barbican it exposed them to the soldiers and archers above. The term shooting fish in a barrel comes to mind here. The next obstacle to be overcome is the portcullis. Designed to run in these slots, it would drop down to the floor. It was constructed in a wooden lattice fashion, so archers could fire arrows through it. And still there were the heavy wooden gates to overcome. This wooden plaque gives a brief description of the gate. Many modifications have been made to the walls to keep pace with progress. Holes have been cut to accommodate the increased traffic. The white part of the gate was added during the Elizabethan period to increase living space. Some 200 metres from Warmgate Bar can be found Bowes Morel House, a rare example of a late 14th century timber-framed building. Micklegate was another gate that once had a barbican. This southerly gate is the one used by royalty when entering the city. This coat of arms belonged to Sir John Lister Kay, Lord Mayor of York in 1737. The coat of arms in the centre was used by King Edward III, King Richard II and Henry IV, the two on either side of the coats of arms of the city of York. In what used to be the gatekeeper's home, there's now a museum. It shows in some detail the way of life in the 16th century. Take this chap, the Duke of York, for instance. He had designs on the throne of England and lost his head for his trouble. His head was stuck on a spike looking into York, rather a dubious honour in that all the other traitors that were beheaded faced away from the city. The last people to be beheaded were two Jacobites in 1746. Incredibly, after 7.5 years on the pole, their heads were stolen and never recovered. There's much to be seen in the museum. This chainmail armour and helmet are just two of the exhibits. Visitors are encouraged to try on the armour and experience how heavy it is. The corner turrets were used as jails. Imagine being in one of these in the middle of winter, with wind and rain pouring in through the unglazed windows.
Oi! Who's that? Come here and show you, sir.
It's said that there are ghosts in the tower, so watch out for Archibald. He still takes his job very seriously. The job of gatekeeper was so important that he and his family had to live within the gate itself. He had to take a sworn oath to undertake his duties responsibly, for it was the city's only line of defence against the plague and other epidemic diseases prevalent at the time. You can imagine then the stigma, not to say the trouble, when the gatekeeper's daughter, little Sarah here, lost the keys to the city. It troubled her so much she was still looking for the keys when she died. It said her ghost is still searching for those lost keys. In times of strife, the gate would form a key part of the wall's defences. The high tower jutting out was designed to give the defenders an excellent field of fire against people attacking the walls. Even carved stone effigies were used to frighten would-be attackers. A little further down the wall is what remains of the metal spikes used to stick the heads of traitors on. Paintings of what the Barbican would have looked like can be seen in the museum. There's also a model which shows how the Barbican was used to defend the city gates. This is by no means all the museum has to offer, and so it's well worth a visit to see for yourself. About 100 metres from Micklegate is a pub called the Windmill. This was originally 3 separate public houses, but over the years they've been joined together. This arched entrance was originally an alley where the stagecoaches would arrive from the south of the country. They'd drive straight through this archway into the courtyard behind. The original use of the buildings is still very evident today. It's no real surprise then that this public house was thought to be one of Dick Turpin's favourite haunts. Question: other than being on the same busy road, what has the cellar in the Windmill pub and the Bar Convent Museum on the other side of the road got in common? Answer: a secret tunnel. During the more troubled times when Catholicism was outlawed and the convent was under close scrutiny, the nuns and priests would come through the tunnel and sleep on these stone beds until the danger had passed. It's thought that this hole in the wall may also have been a priest bolt hole. The Bar Convent's Georgian and Victorian exterior conceals some remarkable features inside. The first, this beautifully glazed and tiled courtyard, with its cast ironworks echoing the Victorian railway style, popular at the time it was built. This great parlour was used by the sisters to entertain special guests. The portraits around the room are some of the prominent sisters who've been members of the order. Sister Mary Ward, seen here, was the foundress of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the early 17th century. Having walked through the quite normal corridors of this building, one is totally unprepared for this. A domed neoclassical chapel, modelled on a chapel near Rome, it possesses enormous beauty and simplicity. In the days when it was built, Catholicism was outlawed, so it had to be concealed from the outside. Other precautions were necessary, and a priest's hiding hole was made, although it was only discovered about 50 years ago when electric wiring was being installed. This relic is the hand of St. Margaret Clitheroe, which is kept in the chapel, although not normally on display. St. Margaret refused to expose the other Catholics that she knew of, and so was put to death. This exhibit at the York Dungeons graphically demonstrates the method of her torture and death. She was laid on the Ouse Bridge, and a large oak door was placed on top of her. Large stones were then placed on top of the door until she was crushed to death. Another striking feature of the Bar Convent is this clock. It was made by Henry Hindley and overlooks the courtyard below. The weights driving the clock travel down the full height of the building. The Convent Museum outlines the history of early Christianity in the north of England and tells the story of Mary Ward. Mary was a Yorkshire woman convinced of her vocation to dedicate her life to God, but was unable to submit to the enclosed life of a 17th century nun. She persuaded the Roman Catholic hierarchy to allow her and her companions to establish schools for Catholic girls throughout Europe. The convent offers a bed and breakfast service with double and single room accommodation. A range of additional facilities are available, from kitchen and dining areas to laundry facilities. There are extensive library facilities, from contemporary cookery books to an antique reference library with religious books and documents dating from 1508 to the 20th century. On the ground floor is a cafe and garden area for visitors. In keeping with Mary Ward's pioneering spirit of education for women, provision of a modern and well-equipped conference centre has been made. The room can accommodate up to 100 people. All the facilities are available for conference hire. The Bar Convent Museum is a fascinating museum run by delightful people. At the York Dungeons, however, all is not quite so pleasant, as the short clip on Margaret Clitheroe demonstrated. If you want an impression of what went on in medieval times, this is the place to find out in graphic detail.
Hello? Come inside. Quickly. I'm one of the guides here at the York Dungeons. You've come at a very awkward moment. You see, the doctor and myself are in the middle of a little medical experiment. We are trying to discover the cure to the disease which has plagued you all. We have not found it yet.
I haven't personally had them, no, but there are quite a few ghosts that are scattered around this building used to be technical college.
Don't see. You've got to artfully hold the X. Know what I mean? You've got to go for a good part of the spinal cord on the back leg. Give it a good whip off the cord.
Yes, thank you. It's a big time, oh, get out of here.
So you've all come to watch me swing, have you? An old Dick Turpin would dance a pretty dance, I wager. But stand not too close, lest I have ye dance with me.
Compact as York is, it can still be difficult to maintain your bearings. Taking a trip on the York tour buses helps solve the problem of locating sites of interest. The tour can also supply a great deal of information and is often accompanied with an advantageous view.
Town, the left-hand side is Barker's Tower. The area around here is where the tanning industry used to be carried out.
You can also use the buses to go from place to place, all using the same day ticket. A more traditional and environmentally friendly way of getting around the city is the horse-drawn carriage. A rank for them can be found by the Minster. Being very popular, though, they can sometimes prove a little difficult to find. The Minster can only be described as magnificent, with its towers and stained glass windows. It's the largest medieval cathedral in Europe. It is indeed fortunate that the windows are still here for us to see today, for in 1644, when the city fell to the parliamentarians, it was the Fairfax family that negotiated the surrender. The terms ensured the protection of the Minster from looting and pillaging, which would certainly have resulted in the destruction of the windows. Today's visitors can walk through the Minster, taking in its splendour. The more adventurous, however, can take the 275 steps to the top of the Lantern Tower, a climb of some 198 feet. In 1967, the central Lantern Tower was found to be settling unevenly, and drastic action was required to prevent further damage and its ultimate collapse. This involved the pouring of several thousand tons of concrete under the cathedral to form adequate foundations. During the subsequent excavations, the remains of a great Roman hall were found. One of the pillars uncovered is now on display outside the cathedral. What's perhaps even more remarkable is that it's quite possible that the pillar these ladies are sitting on also saw the crowning of Constantine the Great, Caesar and Emperor of the Roman Empire in 306 AD. From his position in front of the York Art Gallery, local 19th century painter William Etty has a fine view of Bootham Bar and the Minster. A York-born artist of note, he's well represented within the gallery. The building was designed by the architect Edward Taylor for the 1879 Yorkshire Fine Art and Industrial Exhibition, and has a fine but sadly unfinished Italian Renaissance-style facade. The gallery has a simple layout comprising 2 floors, each with 2 main galleries. There are modern CD-ROM information facilities in the entrance of the gallery. In the main gallery there's a collection of continental old masters, with works by artists such as Franz Snyders, Antoine Watteau and Bernardo Bellotto, to name but a few. The earliest pictures being these 14th century gold ground panels from Italy. This painting of an unknown man with a book was painted by Parmigianino around 1524 and was presented to the gallery in 1955. This Annibale Carracci portrait of Monsignor Agucci, painted in about 1603, can also be found in this part of the gallery. This was presented to the gallery in 1955. The adjacent South Gallery houses a collection of early British paintings with works by local 19th century artist William Etty. This quite magnificent mid-18th century oil painting by Francis Coates, titled The Honourable Lady Stanhope and the Countess of Effingham as Diana and her companion, makes quite a visual impact as you enter the gallery. Francis Coates was a portrait painter and pastelist working in London. He was a founder member of the Royal Academy, and it was only his early death that prevented him from becoming a serious rival to his contemporaries Gainsborough and Reynolds. At the foot of the stairs leading to the first floor and a further 2 galleries can be found this stained glass window by William Peckett, who worked in York in the 18th century. At the top of the stairs is the Milner White Pottery Room. The Dean of York, Eric Milner White, gave this collection to the gallery between 1959 and 1963. The gallery contains an internationally important collection of studio pottery. The Burton Gallery was named after the gallery's first benefactor, John Burton, who bequeathed his fine collection of Victorian art in 1882, which forms the nucleus of the collection. It also contains works by Gwen John, Paul Nash and L.S. Lowry. In the 4th and last main gallery, used for temporary exhibitions, is a series of works that have been bought with the help of the Friends of York Art Gallery. This painting by Hogarth being the latest, it was purchased with money from the Friends of York Art Gallery and a grant from the lottery. The gallery's shop stocks a selection of art books and other related items. Continuing with the art theme, and still within sight of the Minster, can be found the studio of artist Jim Park. Jim paints a variety of subjects as well as the sights and scenes of York. His gallery can be found tucked away in Barker Tower on Lendal Bridge. The tower's medieval construction must have an influence on his paintings. On the opposite side of the river can be found the Museum Gardens, a perfect place to relax or swat up on the latest lecture notes. Alongside the Abbey is the Yorkshire Museum. Purpose-built by the Yorkshire Philosophical Society in the late 1820s, it was designed by William Wilkins. Don't be put off by the Greek Revival facade. It most definitely is not a reflection of what can be seen on the inside. There's usually a special family-orientated exhibition theme running. When we were filming, it was animal magic. Very much designed for hands-on, it included an art room where children can paint and draw the animals on display. Some even find their way onto the gallery's walls. As in many of the York museums and galleries, computers are playing an important part in providing the children with information and stimulation. There's a more serious side to the museum. This model of a Roman soldier is used to show the sort of clothing and armour that was being worn by the Romans in York. This Roman kitchen is a combination of real Roman artifacts and reconstruction. Many other items dating from Roman times are on display. In this section of the gallery, Anglo-Saxon finds can be found. The museum has a large selection of coins and jewellery found in the Yorkshire area. The Ormside bowl was found locally and acquired by the gallery. Another important piece is the Middleham jewel, found in Middleham. This medieval gold jewel is considered the finest piece of Gothic jewellery to have been found in Britain this century. A gold engraved ring was later found in the same location in 1990 and purchased by the museum, ensuring it also stayed in Britain. Both the jewel and the ring were found by metal detectorists. This part of the gallery shows the influence of the Normans. The gallery has been constructed over a part of St Mary's Abbey, so encompassing it inside the museum. The wall leads to a remarkable reconstruction. Using the original stonework as a basis to work from, these archways have been reconstructed to their former splendid state. The geology gallery, called The Hunters and the Hunted, is primarily about fossils of sea creatures that lived millions of years ago. Leaving the museum, you could be forgiven for thinking you'd seen everything there is to be seen in this park. This could be one you may have missed. Rather tucked away, the York Observatory was built in 1832 and for a time housed the world's largest refracting telescope. Another interesting building found in the gardens is the Hospitium. This was a 16th century guest house, which also took care of visitors to the city when they were taken ill, a forerunner to the modern hospital. A healthy and enjoyable way to see a large part of the city is by walking the walls, and there are several official guide companies who organise these walks. There are some people who enjoy their own company, and some who just come to meet friends and exchange the week's news. A round trip of the walls is just a little over 4 kilometres, with most sites and places of interest visible from the walls. One such site is the Ice House, found close to the Monk Bar entrance to the city. Whilst on the opposite side of the city can be seen the first railway station built in York. Built in 1841, it's just over the road from the current mainline station. York's station is still one of the largest in Europe, and York's historic links with the railways and their development draws visitors from all over the world. The railway enthusiast is catered for in a variety of ways. This building contains an extensive model railway layout. The really big stuff can be found here in the National Railway Museum. If you feel like a trip out of York, try the Elvington Air Museum. It houses a collection of aircraft and related items dating back to the Second World War. There are many aircraft on display, these being just a few. Elvington was one of a group of airfields in operation during World War II. With the aid of French wartime archive footage, the control tower has just been reinstated to exactly as it was during the war. Even down to a packet of woodbines and naffy mugs. The view out of the windows, however, is not quite so authentic, not with a Victor jet bomber sat on the apron. The NAFI is an institution that has followed the British servicemen wherever they've gone around the world, providing everything from a cuppa to a hot meal, and here is no exception. Visitors are most welcome. With all the restoration work that's gone on in developing Elvington, a mass of archival material has been collected, so much so that a special section has been established to collate it all. This rich source of information is, with prior arrangement, available to anyone. There's also a section devoted to gunnery, with several gunnery turrets on display. Now, this isn't an instrument of medieval torture, although some old gunners might argue that point. It's one of several turrets that can be seen on display in the gunnery section. During part of the Second World War, Elvington was manned by French airmen, and this replica hangar was constructed by a group in September 1996 as a memorial to their comrades. Inside the hangar can be seen this pink Buccaneer with its armament from the Iraq conflict, along with an English Electric Lightning and several other aircraft of various vintages. But what must be considered the star is Friday the 13th, a renovated Handley Page Halifax. The restoration beginning even before the opening of York Air Museum in 1986. John Hunt took time out from the restoration to take us through the aircraft.
This was the crew rest position, but very often this was piled high with what they called window. Front spar, which gets higher still. This is the front spar, and we have built the aircraft exactly to Halifax drawings, starting at the front spar. And this joint is where we joined on a remade front fuselage to Handley Page drawings. So the stringers and the frames and the rivet pitching, the cleats and the clamps are exactly as the aircraft was 1940, because we built it to Halifax drawings. Where we've got corroded stringers, which may have caused a problem with a lot of people in the front trying to split the fuselage like a postage stamp, the stringers have been renewed and the skin has been doubled in thickness and reinforced so it can take the weight of the nose from the jointed position. In the nose you have a Mark 14 bomb sight. On the left hand side, port side, you have a mechanical bomb sight computer. The bomb aimer's master panel. This device in the front is called a Mickey Mouse, and that ticked to disperse the bombs in the right order according to what selections the bomb aimer made. This is the emergency oxygen bottle that they could plug into when they want to walk about the aircraft. And it's got a little armour plating cover around it, so if it gets hit with anything, you don't get a face full of flying oxygen bottle. The damage is contained within this, hopefully. Eventually we hope to have the aircraft exactly as it was in 1940. So when pilots and the aircrew climb in, they sort of go back 50 years.
Tucked under the wing of the Halifax is probably its biggest antagonist of the war, a replica Messerschmitt 109. There's much more to be seen at Elvington, far too much for us to be able to show in this short programme. Why not go and see it for yourself? York might have a lot of museums and history about it. That's not to say it doesn't know how to enjoy itself. We'll leave you with a few nighttime shots of York as it lets its hair down.